Hi everyone, it's Megan, and today we're going to talk about what knowledge is. So I want to start by calling back to this study that we talked about last time in the logical fallacy video. It's a study from 1951. If you recall, the researchers asked people to match lengths of lines, and they were trying to see if people would change their answer based on what other people in a group were saying. So I wanted to bring this study up and show you how I found it. So that wasn't the first study I read about this topic, we were talking about this in the context of the bandwagon logical fallacy, but kind of the overall idea is peer pressure and good persuasion technique? Like, does it work? Do people change their mind or behavior based on their peers? Generally, they do. So there's 3 other studies here. So this first one I have listed is about people being likely to vote or not. And the researchers found people are more likely to vote if their neighbors will be informed if they voted or not. So a little social shaming can work. The next study I have listed is about people changing their opinion on a highly politicized topic. So if you hold very strongly to some opinion that's highly political, if you're put in a situation where you're surrounded by people who disagree with you, you're more likely to change your mind based on those other people's opinions rather than if you were just provided like new information about the situation, for example. And this second study is actually where I found that first one from the 50s. So I just want to mention that because that's a good way to find sources, is actually by looking at, well, what is this source citing? What was this author reading, right? And then this last one I chose, I think it's a good example of a couple things. So it's not published yet, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. They're looking at Yelp reviews and how they affect revenue at a restaurant. And they found that if people are more likely to go to a restaurant if other people have given that restaurant a good review on Yelp. This is probably not surprising to a lot of people. I know that I've used online reviews to choose a restaurant to go to, and we might think about some of the motivations behind why these work. So we've talked about, social shame, or last time I think we mentioned people just wanting to be polite and get along with others. This last one, Yelp, I think is a good example of sometimes it's just convenience. I don't want to go to every restaurant in town and figure out which ones are the bad ones, right? It's easier to rely on kind of what other people say. But I want us to think about these sources in a bigger way. So first there's, generally around this big idea that peer pressure works and can be effective and changing human behavior. It's about consensus. So a group of people agree that this is true. So these studies are looking at that question from different angles, but they come to the same or similar conclusion that peer pressure is effective in changing what people do. Now, how do we know that we can trust these sources, right? So we want to look at who published them. So I've highlighted here, you can see American Political Science Review, PLOS1, I don't know if that's pronounced +1 or PLOS, and American Economic Journal, Applied Economics. So what all these sources have in common is that they are peer-reviewed. This is something really important to be aware of. So I want to talk about what this means a little bit. So we'll start with that question. What is the peer review process? So the first thing that happens is an author submits an article, right? Then it's assessed by the editor. If they don't think it's a good match for the journal, or they think it's bad science or what have you, they'll reject it. But if they think it has some merit, they'll send it through to reviewers. And then usually what happens is it's going to be sent back to the authors for revisions. They're going to request some revisions. So then the authors have to revise it, send it to the editor, and this can happen a few different times, which is why, excuse me, I'm going to zoom back out. So if we go back to that previous slide here, notice these dates here that originally I think this was written and put online as a working paper in 2011. They've revised it in March 2016 and they're working on submitting it to the American Economic Journal. So I wanted to point that out to show how long this process can take. It's a can be years before peer-reviewed research gets published. Here, and eventually what's going to happen is either it's going to finally get rejected, or it's going to get accepted and published as the end goal. It's generally a good sign when they're asking for revisions. They're generally not going to do that unless they have the intention of publishing the paper, because it would be a waste of their time, right? So that's a good sign when authors are in that review process. But we want to be careful of accepting views in papers that are not peer-reviewed yet. And it's becoming more common that people are putting working papers online before the peer review process is complete. And that's just because it takes so many years that if they want to talk to somebody about their research now, it helps to put the working paper out before that process is complete. But it's something to keep in mind when you're trying to assess if a source is a good source or not. One of the things that people are looking at when they're assessing papers for publication, the different fields are going to look at different things, and there's going to be all sorts of technical knowledge, because people too, that somebody in the American Political Science Review, the people reviewing that paper are experts in the field. So they've spent years studying this topic, so they know the types of questions to be asking the authors and the types of information to be looking for. These are two things that are pretty common across a lot of disciplines. So reviewers are going to be asking if their research is valid. So it's valid if it measures what it claims to measure. So for example, if I was going to say, I'm going to give you an intelligence test and then I ask you to do push-ups, doesn't make a lot of sense. That would not be valid. How many push-ups you do doesn't necessarily mean anything about mental intelligence, right? And then reliable is research is reliable if it's replicable. So that means that somebody else should be able to follow the methods section in a research paper and get the same results as the researchers. It shouldn't be like a fluke of, you hear about somebody got some of their own DNA into a DNA sample by mistake or something, right? So those are two really important measures, kind of across disciplines generally, although it's going to vary pretty widely by discipline when you get into the details. But this is good information to know how this process works so that you can start to assess sources and be a better consumer of all media. So our next step then, now that we know what peer review is determining, are these peer-reviewed sources? So an easy way to do that is just to Google the name of the source. So when I did that, this is one source that comes up. So I'm just going to zoom in here. This comes up even before I click on anything. I get a preview from Wikipedia talking about American Political Science Review. And you'll notice here that it says that it's a peer-reviewed academic journal. So that's a good starting place. I think you'll hear a lot of professors say, don't use Wikipedia. It's not a good source. There's some validity to those claims because anybody can edit Wikipedia, right? So you don't know if you can trust it all the time. But I think generally it can be a good starting place if you're trying to get introduced to a topic. So far it's looking good, but we probably want to check with another source just to be sure, right? So a different results from that Google search, I have the preview down here. So this is even before you click on it, from cambridge.org, and this is something .org is a little bit more trustworthy than .com, so that's something good there. It's a premier scholarly research journal providing peer-reviewed articles, right? So it says that just in the preview, so you click into it, and then you'll find that full statement within that web page. And you could even do this with a third website. The more websites you can get to kind of tell you the same information, the more confident I think you can be about this being true. So I did that with all three of these, and they're all peer-reviewed. One thing to keep in mind, though, is just because you're reading an article that's peer-reviewed, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's consensus about the topic, even though there's, a peer review, so a group of experts in the field or, peers of that researcher have reviewed the research and determined it's reliable, it's valid, the methods make sense. The person understands the past research in the area. They can trust this study. just because something's published peer reviewed doesn't mean it becomes established knowledge in the field. It's maybe not considered knowledge yet. So one peer-reviewed study is a good starting place, but it's not considered consensus until other people read it and agree. So you can think about how long this process takes. We saw that paper from 2011 that's still going through the peer-reviewed process today. After that's published, it's going to have to, experts are going to read the journal. And, they're going to decide if this makes sense or if it's contradicting something, if they think that there's maybe some problem with the methods that the researchers were using. So you can see there's a lot of different people involved, and generally they're all people who are experts in the field and have studied a topic at length. This is kind of a fun chart showing different studies. So each dot represents one medical study on this chart, and it's titled Everything We Eat Both Causes and Prevents Cancer. So the source down here is Schoenfield from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. So they just mapped what different studies say about the same food item. So wine, for example, here's all the studies saying that it protects against cancer, but then there's also some studies saying that it causes cancer. So you might see headlines though in the news saying like, drink a glass of red wine to prevent cancer, or wine prevents cancer. Kind of these really simplistic headlines that maybe don't give us the full picture of what's going on. And that's what's going to be the reading for this week, is actually the article that this diagram comes from. And the author is going to talk about this more, about how the media tends to report on scientific studies versus how people in STEM disciplines think about knowledge, because they're not really congruent. So what we'd want to do, if we were trying to really understand if wine prevents cancer or causes cancer, we'd want to look at all of these studies together, and we might be able to determine that wine has, maybe there's a certain property of wine that can prevent against cancer, and there's a different property that can cause cancer, right? We'd want to really compare specific what they're testing within here and look at all of those studies together. So even with those kind of caveats though, so after we go through this whole process of peer review, the study's published, that study is put in conversation with many other similar studies about the same topic. And when people start to kind of find the same thing over and over again about the same question, that's when it becomes knowledge and consensus. And in science, there's always room for error, and people are going to want to be proving each other wrong. I think that if a scientist can prove something wrong that tons of people hold to be true, that's a big deal. And that is something that's going to generate a lot of media and be good for that scientist's career. So there's incentive to do that, but it's incredibly difficult to do that. At the same time, it's not impossible. We have a lot of examples in history of this happening, right? So there's the general philosophy when we look at science and how it works is that there's not really an end truth that we can arrive at. We can get, the closest thing we can get to knowing that something is true is through this process and arriving at consensus. But there's always this kind of humility that we might be wrong, right? So there's different levels of confidence of knowledge. And so we want to be very aware of what level of confidence that we're at exactly, right? And that's what really this week's article is talking a lot about, how I think that the level of confidence isn't always presented accurately. So I want to end with this kind of fun example, and I purposely chose talking about the bandwagon fallacy more in depth when we discussed logical fallacies, because I think it offers an interesting juxtaposition against consensus. Because if you think about what's going on, consensus is kind of like, well, a bunch of people agree and say it, right? Which is kind of similar to bandwagon. Only one of them is how we produce, the closest thing we can get to the truth, or, consensus scientific knowledge. And one of them is a logical fallacy. They can look pretty similar, but they're pretty different in terms of, being experts in the field versus not experts, or why people are saying a certain thing, right? So let's say we've got this situation where we've got a bunch of people over here saying it's going to rain. This one person over here saying it's going to be sunny today. You might not know who to believe, right? Because you don't want to fall into the bandwagon, logical fallacy, and agree with them just to agree with them. But you also want to understand if something's bigger is going on here, like a consensus of professionals in the field who've all looked at the same evidence and come to similar conclusions. So, should you bring an umbrella today? Some questions to ask when looking at this question. You might ask, who are these people who say it will rain? Do they have anything to gain from saying it will rain? Like, do they sell umbrellas, for example? Or are they experts in their field? Or is this a group of meteorologists? And we want to ask questions too of this person over here, right? So why does this person think it's going to be sunny? What evidence are they using? Does this person need to get their eyes checked, right? If they're the only person saying this, maybe it's not so much the evidence they're looking at, but maybe they're using a tool that's a little faulty, something like that, right? Or maybe they're correct and they're going against the established consensus and they're going to change the norms of what we think about a certain topic, right? It can be pretty exciting. So these are two ideas that I think on the surface appear to contradict each other, but when you understand more how knowledge is generated in science, you can start to see the differences. It's not really just bandwagon jumping on something because everybody else is saying it. It's much more complicated than that, right? All right, and so that's it for this presentation about what is knowledge. So thank you guys, and I'll see you next time.